How does a man take control of the World Trade Center in a $3.2 billion deal, and just 47 days later, turned that massive liability into one of the largest insurance claims in history? This is the question that ignited 2 decades of suspicion, the eerie overlap of timing, tragedy, and money that still chills people today. In the summer of 2001, Larry Silverstein, a seasoned New York real estate mogul, secured a 99-year lease on the entire WTC complex. His personal cash at risk, just $14 million, a microscopic fraction for a deal controlling over 10 million square feet of prime Manhattan real estate. It was hailed as a landmark transaction, the first time the towers were privatized. But less than 7 weeks later, the unthinkable happened. The towers fell, and the world changed forever. And that's where the timing becomes impossible to ignore. One detail that never stops raising eyebrows is the reason Silverstein wasn't in the towers that morning. He had a last-minute dermatologist appointment, an appointment that saved his life. For some, it's simply fate. For others, it's a red flag, glowing so brightly it could be seen from space. But the real financial mystery began not with where Silverstein was, but with what his lawyers found in the ruble. The insurance contract worth billions wasn't finished. It was still in what's called a binder phase. The deal was agreed to in principle, but the final, legally defining language hadn't been signed yet. And one word inside that unfinished paperwork would become the most important word in the entire story. Occurrence. Was the 911 attack one occurrence? Or two? 2 planes? 2 towers? 2 impacts? 2 collapses? Silverstein's legal team argued they were 2 separate insured events, which meant the insurers owed double the policy limit, a staggering $7.1 billion. The media loved the headline. Silverstein made $1 billion profit, but the reality was far more complicated and far more dangerous. His maximum original coverage was about $3.55 billion. The estimated cost to rebuild the entire site, over $7 billion. If he didn't win the insurance battle, the entire redevelopment of Ground Zero could have collapsed financially. Not profit, ruin. That's the real hook. A single ambiguous word in an unfinished contract became the line between rebuilding a national landmark and leaving Lower Manhattan a graveyard of debt and twisted steel. The stage was set. The insurers prepared for war, and the world was watching. How many planes does it take to trigger 2 separate insurance payouts? And what financial principle allows a single tragedy to legally split into multiple billion-dollar claims? This is the riddle at the heart of the Silverstein case. A national catastrophe turned into the most explosive property insurance lawsuit in American history. When Larry Silverstein signed the World Trade Center lease, he inherited an insurance policy with a hard cap, $3.55 billion per occurrence. But what, exactly, counted as an occurrence? On September 11th, 2 different planes struck 2 different towers at 2 different moments in time. Was that 1 attack? Or 2? If it was ruled a single event, Silverstein would receive roughly $3.55 billion. If it was ruled 2 events, the payout could double to $7.1 billion, enough to finance the monumental cost of clearing, reconstructing, and resurrecting Ground Zero. This is where the public's fear kicked in. Was a billionaire trying to profit off unimaginable tragedy? But for Silverstein, the fear was far simpler and far more concrete. Rebuilding the site would cost more than $7 billion. Accepting a single occurrence payout would mean immediate bankruptcy, a failed reconstruction, and the total collapse of the WTC redevelopment before it even started. The real drama wasn't greed. It was survival, and the excitement, at least for the legal world, came from a maddening loophole buried inside the paperwork, because the WTC lease was rushed through just weeks before the attacks. The dozens of insurers involved weren't all working off the same contract. Some drafts clearly defined occurrence in a way that favored a single claim. Other drafts didn't define it at all, giving Silverstein's legal team just enough ambiguity to argue their now famous logic: 2 planes, 2 impacts, 2 towers, 2 occurrences. The courtroom fight erupted into a years-long war. Swiss Re and other global insurers dug in, determined to limit the payout to just one claim. Silverstein's side argued that no definitive contract language existed. Therefore, the attacks should be treated separately. Meanwhile, American emotions were boiling. Lower Manhattan lay in ruin, yet progress on rebuilding stalled. Not because of engineering challenges, but because of a technical definition in a half-finished insurance binder. It became a grim metaphor for the moment. A mountain of twisted steel on the ground, and a mountain of legal paperwork above it. After years of litigation, the verdict wasn't a clean win for either side. In 2007, both camps agreed to a complex settlement totaling $4.55 billion, far more than the insurers wanted. Far less than the maximum Silverstein sought. What the settlement confirmed was this: Silverstein's argument worked. He forced the world's biggest insurers to pay billions more than they planned, and every dollar of it was immediately swallowed by the enormous, unavoidable cost of rebuilding the most symbolic commercial center on Earth. Profit only if you ignore the $12 billion reconstruction bill attached to the lease. In reality, it wasn't a windfall. It was the only path to keep Ground Zero from becoming a permanent financial crater. The occurrence battle wasn't a trick. It was a fight for the right to rebuild. And it hinged on a single word that wasn't supposed to matter until it did. Did Larry Silverstein walk away from 9/11s with $1 billion profit? Or did he inherit the most expensive real estate nightmare in modern American history? This question, the split between conspiracy and reality, is what keeps the Silverstein story alive 2 decades later. Because to understand what really happened, you have to step into the moment when the legal battle ended and the financial horror began. And nothing fuels that curiosity more than the most disputed quote in the entire 9/11's narrative. Silverstein's infamous remark about WTC-7, the 47-story tower that collapsed hours after the planes hit. In a 2002 PBS documentary, Silverstein said he told a fire commander, "Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it." Then he added, "And then we watched the building collapse." Those 2 sentences detonated the conspiracy world. For many, pull it sounded like insider code, a term associated with controlled demolitions. The idea that a billionaire landlord could casually order a skyscraper pulled in the middle of a national catastrophe ignited the darkest fear people already held. That the systems controlling power and profit are always one step ahead of the truth. But the official explanation, and the one supported by structural engineers, paints a completely different picture. WTC-7 had suffered massive structural damage from falling debris, lost critical water pressure, and burned uncontrolled for hours. In that Spool it has long been interpreted as withdrawing firefighters, not pushing a button on explosives that didn't exist. Could a 47-story tower be wired for demolition in a matter of minutes? Experts say no. Such preparations take weeks, often months. But the ambiguity of the phrase, delivered in the fog of trauma and grief, became the perfect spark for suspicion. And suspicion thrives where money is involved. Because yes, Silverstein received a $4.55 billion settlement. But here's the part missing from every he profited headline. He also inherited a $12 billion reconstruction obligation. His lease required him to rebuild the entire complex. Not one tower, not 2, but the whole thing. The insurance payout wasn't a windfall. It was barely enough to keep the project alive. The real terror wasn't that Silverstein would get rich. It was that without those billions, Ground Zero might remain an open scar, a crater of lawsuits, debt, and political paralysis. To rebuild, Silverstein had to do what few businessmen would dare: take on tens of billions in loans, negotiate with the state and federal government, and secure tax-exempt Liberty bonds, effectively putting the U.S. taxpayer into the deal. He didn't walk away with a fortune. He walked into the most scrutinized, expensive, emotionally charged construction project on American soil. And that's the twist that reshapes the narrative. Silverstein didn't use the insurance money to escape Ground Zero. He used it to chain himself to it. Not for profit, but for control, a once-in-a-generation chance to reshape the most symbolic square of real estate in the world. When a billionaire receives billions after a disaster, the public instinctively assumes one thing: he walked away richer. But not all billions are created equal. And in the Silverstein saga, the central question isn't how much did he get. It's how much was he forced to take on, because the $4.55 billion insurance payout was not a jackpot. It wasn't a wire transfer into a personal account. It was the financial oxygen required to keep a 99-year obligation alive. When Larry Silverstein signed the lease in July 2001, he did more than acquire the World Trade Center. He accepted a century-long responsibility, and that responsibility didn't vanish on September 11th. It intensified. Even with nothing but rubble on the site, his lease with the Port Authority still required him to pay close to $10 million a month in rent. No buildings, no tenants, no revenue. Just a crater in Lower Manhattan and a contract that didn't care about tragedy. On top of that monthly burn rate, he was legally obligated to rebuild a project that would soon be estimated at more than $12 billion and stretch across decades. This is the part the public rarely sees. The difference between receiving billions and being forced to immediately deploy them. But here's where the story flips from survival to strategy. The insurance settlement became the foundation, the keystone for a far larger financial structure. Because in high-stakes real estate, money is never the end game. It's leverage. With $4.55 billion secured, Silverstein suddenly had what lenders care about most: capital, credibility, and a legal mandate to rebuild. He leveraged that settlement to raise billions more from private institutional partners and, crucially, tax-exempt Liberty bonds issued by the government to revive Lower Manhattan. These bonds essentially made the U.S. taxpayer a silent co-investor in the reconstruction. And this is the genius in the final calculus. Silverstein's original $14 million personal investment didn't buy him income, it bought him control. Decades of control over the redevelopment rights, over the design, over future leases, and over what would become one of the most valuable commercial complexes in the world. The profit wasn't the check, the profit was the position. While the world argued about insurance technicalities, Silverstein quietly transformed himself from a leaseholder into the master developer of the new World Trade Center. The sole steward of the most symbolically charged real estate project in American history. The truth is far more complex than a billionaire cashing out. Silverstein didn't pocket billions. He deployed them into a financial gauntlet that only a handful of people on Earth could survive. And by surviving it, he emerged with something far more powerful than a payout. A once-in-a-generation ownership opportunity. The lesson for the audience is stark and uncomfortable. The wealthy don't make fortunes from events. They make them from obligations. From leberog, from positioning, from turning chaos into long-term assets. Larry Silverstein didn't profit from 9/11s. He pivoted, turning catastrophe into control, and control into a multi-decade empire.